SAR stands for synthetic aperture radar. My rather primitive understanding of this technique is that it can detect the seismic movements, i.e. the micro movements, that occur around a structure, and those tiny movements, which probably are caused by the general movement within Cairo, the coming and goings, the trucks, they all create tiny seismic movements. And by recording that and the effect of that on the structure, they can determine where the voids are. And this technique was used to determine the internal structure of the Great Pyramid and hence create these diagrams. Hopefully I've understood it right, but once again, read the article, which I'm showing right now. The article is an open access article written by Filippo Biondi and Malanga. What they did to find out this information and the science behind it is in itself quite fascinating. And what's even more fascinating is that they didn't even have to go to the Great Pyramid to do this. It was all done by satellite. And it means that they've released this information without it having to pass through the hands of the Egyptologists. The images have been created using a form of technology using micro movements, and these micro movements are caused by seismic waves, and then the detection of these micro movements are then graphed and the analysis done of what voids appear within the pyramid. The end result is the high-resolution 3D tomographical imaging, which we're going to discuss next. This diagram is from the article, and it shows the objects that were already known about, both physically encountered, i.e. the King's Chamber, the Queen's Chamber, the grotto, etc., as well as the void found by the other scanning project, the Muon, and that is a big void which they've been able to put more of a shape and size to in terms of this scan. But in addition to that, there is a whole wishbone structure of passages which ascend up parallel to the ascending passage, and a passage that goes around the back of the King's Chamber, and another set of smaller passages which go right around the King's Chamber. You will see that there is some underground aspects. So there is one that goes directly down through a shaft from the entranceway to a series of rooms. And anyone familiar with some of the things that you can see in Egypt will already have guessed that those rooms will have large granite boxes in them. So there will be no surprises there, but we'll have to wait and see till they get into them. In my opinion, this passage will extend very deeply into the ground and then will level off and then will be part of a complex of passages deep underground Giza. There are very small interconnecting passages between that hallway or passageway around the King's Chamber to the wishbone structure. And you can see that highlighted in black, moving from the orange passageway around the King's Chamber through to the wishbone in the light grey. There are also passages coming from the Queen's Chamber, one that goes into a room, and then another passage from that room into a bigger chamber. Now, these are passages that it is suspected that the Egyptologists already know about, and they may in fact have been into the first one. There was an announcement made by Zahi Hawass to the effect that they had found something along those lines. So this should not be a surprise to anyone. But the passage that goes from that room to another room might be a surprise. So the next thing I'm going to show you is the list of the discovered structures detected. And so it lists them out, and those numbers correspond to the numbers in the diagrams that I've already shown you. And I'll just leave you to read through those so that you can see where the various things are and what they're calling them. As I delve into all the information coming from the SAR scan of the Great Pyramid of Khufu, I'm both overwhelmed and excited by all that I'm reading about. So there's quite a lot here, but I'm going to start, as I say, with the Queen's Chamber. So this is the Queen's Chamber here. So let's have a look and see where it is on this big schematic drawing. So here from the study, they've provided a breakdown of measurements from each of the various aspects of the scan. So let's focus in now on the Queen's Chamber and just have a much closer look at it. It looks pretty much the same as we've always told it looks, the area in the black. We did know about the areas that had been excavated, and they were only partially excavated. And we also, there's been hints that people like Zahi Hawass has found something in the, or beyond the niche, or under the niche, I'm not sure which. So if we're looking at this diagram, it's that's probably what he's found, is this passage that goes through to one room, and then from that room there is another passage which goes through to a much bigger room. And I think that bigger room will be very, very interesting. So the diagram we're looking at now is the general archaeological understanding of what is currently there, what we currently know about. So you can see the shaft coming out at one side. You can see the niche. You can see the uneven floor. You can see where parts of it have been excavated. So it actually does give a very good perspective on what is currently known of the Queen's Chamber. But what we've found in the new study goes well and beyond that. So now we're just going to have a look at one of the scans and the findings from that scan. So this is the basic three-dimensional model with one of the scans next to it. Now let's zoom in on the Queen's Chamber and have a good look at it from a variety of different perspectives. In the study, when referring to the Queen's Chamber, it says a further structure identified with the number 14 in the 3D model is located below the Queen's Chamber and connected to it through a small conduit. From space number 14, the conduit seems to continue, bonding a similar path which, from the room known as the grotto, leads to the underground room called Unfinished. The reference tomography is shown in figure 52b, while the 3D model is depicted in figure 52a, and this is the model from 52a. The red arrow denotes the chamber that is underneath the Queen's Chamber, and then you can see from there that there are passages or conduits leading off from that. Now, if we look at it from another angle, you can then see the conduits a bit more clearly and how they relate to the other aspects. Now let's look at it from another completely different angle, and you can see on this alternative view the way that the passages between the new chamber and the bigger chamber are related. So that pretty much covers everything to do with the Queen's Chamber and the new chambers below the Queen's Chamber. But as you can see from these models, there's a heap more to cover. This time, we're going to take a look at the King's Chamber and the passages and chambers that appear to be around it. So I'm going to start by talking about my own personal experience of the King's Chamber and the things that are around it, and then we'll start looking at the scans and the findings or conclusions made in terms of those scans. So before you manage to get into the King's Chamber, you end up going into this area that it feels like it's a limbo area, but then you look up and you see all the details within the chamber. So here's the footage I took of that chamber.
Yeah. So they waved the current, but we lost this part.
Some crazy Frenchman. He's got the one.
Going into this area is a little bit weird because you have to bend over and walk in, crouch down, and then you can stand up and look up and see all this weird stuff above you. And then to get into the King's Chamber, you have to once again crouch down to go through a very small area until you reach the King's Chamber. My footage of the King's Chamber isn't great, but it'll give you a fair idea of what is in there and how it feels. So here's my personal footage. So that was just a few snippets of what I saw in the King's Chamber, and the precision is amazing. I even took a level with me so that I could see exactly how level the place was. So that was also shown in my recordings. So let's focus now on what has been coming out of these findings from the SAR scan. This is probably the most simple of the diagrams to come out of the SAR scan paper, and its objective was to provide measurements, but it actually also provides quite a good kind of introduction to what you can see when you look at the more detailed findings. So as you can see, there are passages that wrap around the King's Chamber, and there are additional small chambers located in various places around the King's Chamber. Now let's have a look at some of the scan information and the information that came out of the paper, because they provide both the scan pictorially and they provide it overlaid over a diagram of that same area. Now, these pictures don't actually give us any new information as such, but they do give us a very clear idea of how they have put together the scans to create the topographical map that they have done of the Great Pyramid. So now we'll just look at a few of the diagrams that they've provided, and they provide it from different angles. So from this particular angle, you can see the King's Chamber and the Z above the King's Chamber, and that's the large block in black with what looks like a sloped two-sided roof on the top, and it has around it in orange a series of passages, and in several parts along those passages there are green sections which are chambers. From the next diagram, it's obvious that there isn't any direct access from the King's Chamber through to the passages in orange. But if we look at it from another angle, you can see that from those orange passages, there are also some conduits. They seem to be much smaller passages in black, leading off from the orange passages. Now, I haven't mentioned the very, very large green chamber because that is the void, and that's probably something that we should discuss in a separate episode. So I'm just going to leave that out of this discussion at present and focus on the areas around the King's Chamber. And from this diagram, you can see that there is an area underneath the King's Chamber, which seems to be around where the sarcophagus is, that leads to another chamber. I'll see if I can find another diagram so that you can see that a little bit better. So looking at it from underneath, you get to see another perspective of it. And there is the white chamber that seems to be located underneath the sarcophagus or stone box that's within the King's Chamber. And it has a passage going from it up to another chamber. So that chamber is labelled 13, and it has another passageway from it that keeps ascending and joins up with the wishbone structure that's around the outer part of the structure. So that's another area that we will be discussing in a different episode. But from that wishbone part of the passage, there seems to be another passage that comes off it that meets the orange passages that then go all the way around the King's Chamber. Now let's look at it from a completely different angle. So we'll look at it from this perspective so you can see the two passages, the one going into the wishbone structure and the passage coming out of the wishbone structure and meeting up with the orange passages that go around the King's Chamber. And then we'll look at it in another perspective and you can see it from the opposite angle, and it becomes quite clear that it's kind of like a place where you come up to from the underside of the King's Chamber, and you change passages and then you go up and into the orange passages. And before you get to the orange passages, there seems to be another chamber. So let's have a look at it in a more simplified diagram so that you can see it coming from the wishbone structure towards the orange passages. And those orange passages go all the way around the King's Chamber and Z, and then they go into further passages to the Great Void, which we will talk about another day. But along the way, there are some further chambers, and this is all very, very intriguing. So in the model from the scan, the areas that I put the white arrows pointing to are all new chambers that are being suggested by this study based on the results of the SAR scan. So from the King's chamber, it looks like there is another chamber directly underneath in the direction of the sarcophagus. From that chamber that is underneath, there is a passage that looks as if it climbs upwards towards the wishbone structure, and along the way there is another small chamber, and then from the wishbone structure it climbs further to the orange passageways, once again with a chamber along the way, and then the orange passageways wrap all the way around the King's Chamber and Z before 2 additional passageways lead on to the Great Void, with of course some extra chambers along the way. So this time I'm going to talk about the void. It's something that they've already found from other scans. We're just waiting with bated breath to find out if they managed to get in there. But this scan actually gives a map of how to get there. This next picture is the actual scan itself from the paper, and it's overlaid against a diagram of the main components of the Great Pyramid. And you can see it's very similar to the results found by the Scan Pyramid project that was done by the Heritage Innovation Preservation Institute. And this is one of the pictures from their website showing the void. So back to the actual SAR scan that we're talking about, and it's showing quite a few interesting aspects, and from that they've created this model. So we'll just look at it from a few different angles. We're just going to talk about the wishbone aspect of the findings that came out of the scan. So let's just have a close look at what the wishbone actually looks like on the diagram that came from the scan. So this is the diagram that came from the scan. So this is the diagram that the authors created in order to make sense of what they saw in the various scans. This angle, I think, is the best angle for actually seeing the wishbone structure. And in order to just make it extra clear, I'm going to highlight it in yellow. So here's another angle, and you can see the way it wraps around the outer parts of the pyramid and then goes underground. Anyway, so the wishbone is all the white parts around the outer part of the pyramid, and there's a grey part at the back which is part of that wishbone. Anyway, let's have a look at the scan itself. The diagram done by the authors, and alongside it is one of the original scans, and this one is one of the better scans for looking at the wishbone structure. You can see in this scan both the legs going up towards the surface, where it then turns and heads upwards, and it's a very clear scan. And here's a 3D model of that same diagram. It seems to have a form of step structure in it. I don't know why, but on some other scans you can actually see something that looks like these great big steps. And then it reaches a certain point, and you then go into another passageway and head downwards. Here it is from another angle and another scan to match the diagram that is being shown, and once again it's very clear. And yet another angle of diagram and scan, and this scan is the one that best shows those steps that I mentioned before. So this wishbone structure, if I'm correct, provides access from the underground tunnels that are underneath Giza. You then go up through the ascending part of one of the wishbone arms. You turn the corner, go up further, right up into the inside of the pyramid until you reach the very back of the wishbone, and halfway along the wishbone you can either go down through one passage into the lower part of the king's chamber, so underneath the king's chamber, or you can take the other passage and go up and into the orange area that goes around the outside of the king's chamber and is the access way to the Great Void. In my opinion, this diagram is missing one piece of the puzzle, which would be a shaft from close to that area where the wishbone meets the passages that go towards the king's chamber. And I believe that there would be a shaft somewhere in that vicinity that would go very deep down into the ground. So that's pretty much the wishbone structure in a nutshell. So far we've talked about the chambers that are around the Queen's chamber, the passages around the King's chamber, the wishbone structure around the whole thing, and now it's the underground aspect. We're talking about the passages and what look like chambers at the front of the pyramid, underneath the entranceway. When we look at the scan, we can see a long passage and then multiple chambers coming off that passage, and it is very reminiscent of what you see at the Serapeum. The access to this area, based on the model created by the scientists, shows that there is no access way to this area from any of the other components that we've discussed. There is one little area in the middle that sticks up, and it looks as if that goes very close to what we consider the ordinary entranceway. Let's look at it from another angle, and you can see that white shaft going straight down from just off to one side of that entranceway. If you want to see a really amazing rendering of this particular model, go to YouTube and check out a creator called Vicious Stones, who has redone this model so that it can be moved around. So we can theorize what will be found in these chambers, and I'm sure most of you will be guessing it will be some impressive stone boxes, like in the Serapeum or in the Osiris shaft, and many other places as well. But it will be so exciting when and if they manage to get down there and into those chambers. And finally, I want to look at another view of a different scan done by these people, and it is trying to combine the information so you can see it in one picture. I have been saying for some time that the Great Pyramid was built in 2 stages. There was a much smaller pyramid during the early days of this structure, and later on it was expanded into a much larger structure, and then even later on it was reclad by the dynastic Egyptians. When you look at this particular aspect of one of the scans, you can actually see that it has two structures. So anyway, that's just from my perspective. In this paper, we have shown how it is possible to use SAR-MM Doppler tomography in an advantageous, economical, non-invasive, and rapid way to make a valid contribution in the study of the structure of ancient megalithic monuments, such as the Pyramid of Khufu. We are aware that only by confirmation on the field of our findings can we validate our hypothesis. However, it seems logical to provide a hypothetical interpretation based on the data we collected that could serve as a starting point for future research. From our point of view, the results obtained on the Pyramid of Khufu must be considered in their entirety, globally, not locally, thus taking into account the new structures found within it, the existence of which was previously unknown, all of which are connected. We have also discovered and measured that the pyramids of Giza Plateau present on all faces spatial indentations that tend to divide them in two with respect to the axes of central symmetry, constituted by their vertices. In this context, it seems clear that the multitude of structures, together with the octagonal feature of Khufu, are to be seen as connected features. The numerous structures, thus, seem to belong to a gigantic resonator, with the Z that, in our personal opinion, could function as a high-order, probably fifth-order, low-pass acoustic filter due to its multi-layer and hence multi-stage characteristic. At the time of the construction of the pyramids, the Nile most probably reached the Giza plain, and the pyramids were probably flooded with water up to a couple of meters from their base. This explains why rowing boats were found without masts to support the sails. Once we have consolidated this article, we will need to provide an add-on explaining in detail the function of each chamber. At this point, it might not be all wrong to assume that many of the structures inside the pyramid could have been purposefully flooded several times a year and thus left with the liquid flowing inside. The excess water could then be expelled from the shafts, which then, thanks to the distortions on the faces, those estimated from the external results, acted as conveyors so that the water could be transported by gravity to the ground in an orderly manner. By looking at the estimated tomographs, we were able to realize that the inner areas could be reached safely from a precise point identified by the entrance corridor on the north side, tag 17. From our point of view, it is possible to open a minimally invasive passageway, which is the way to the exploration of all structures surveyed. This could be completed simply by drilling a passage from the main entrance, i.e. by drilling tag 18. In addition, the work carried out on Khufu will certainly be extended to look inside other megalithic structures, even those belonging to other continents. At present, the research team is carrying out the same work as for Khufu, but extended to the Pyramid of Khafre in order to have a more complete overview of the megalithic apparatus of Giza. We are confident that this will also provide Khafre's internal results in the near future. In conclusion, these discoveries, we believe it is appropriate for the Egyptian authorities to begin a campaign of excavations and drilling in order to bring to light and give back to all humanity all the structures we estimated through the use of the proposed method. In the near future, we would like to extend the SAR methodology to the investigation of the internal structure of other important monuments of the Giza Plateau. And really all I can say from this point on, having read all that, is wow. Just wow.